She'd never been kissed, never been held, never even been tempted, until she stepped into the home of James Holt, the guarded billionaire single dad who'd just hired her as his nanny. She was there for his daughter. He swore he'd keep his distance. But in a house full of shadows and secrets, one stolen moment could shatter every boundary and change all three of their lives forever. The late afternoon sun was sinking low when Stella Morgan stepped off the train, a cool autumn wind lifting the ends of her scarf. She adjusted her grip on her suitcase, a scuffed navy roller bag that had seen better days, and glanced around the small countryside station. This was a long way from the cramped apartment she'd shared with her sister in the city. She could still feel the faint buzz of traffic in her bones, even though here, the only sounds were the hum of a vending machine and the rustle of amber leaves. Across the road, a sleek black SUV idled by the curb. The driver, a man in his 40s wearing a dark blazer, stepped forward. "Miss Morgan?" he asked, his voice polite but efficient. "Yes," Stella replied, managing a small smile. "Mr. Holt sent me to pick you up." He took her suitcase with a practiced ease and opened the back passenger door. The drive from the station was quiet, save for the low thrum of the engine and the occasional GPS prompt. The roads wound through hills and farmland until they entered a long, tree-lined driveway. The leaves overhead formed a copper and gold canopy, and at the end of the path, the house came into view. It wasn't the kind of old, drafty manor Stella had pictured. Holt House was modern and sharp-edged, all glass, black steel, and smooth wood, with clean lines that made it look like it had been cut from a lifestyle magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the sky, and somewhere inside those walls lived the man she'd be working for. When they pulled up, the front door opened before the driver could knock. A woman in her late 50s with warm eyes stepped outside. "You must be Stella," she said, her tone friendly. "I'm Carla, the house manager. Come in before you freeze." Inside, the warmth hit instantly, not just the temperature, but the cozy scent of coffee and something cinnamon sweet. The living room opened up like an architectural dream. Minimalist furniture, an oversized fireplace, and shelves lined with books and art pieces that looked more personal than decorative. "Let me show you your room first," Carla said. They took the stairs to the second floor, the walls lined with framed photographs. Not the stiff, formal kind, but candid shots of a little girl laughing, a man holding a surfboard, a dog mid-leap on a beach. The room was airy and bright, with a wide window overlooking the backyard and its infinity pool. "That's yours," Carla said. "The room next door is Sophie's. She's 6. Very smart. Very energetic." Stella smiled. "I think we'll get along." "You'll meet her soon," Carla said. "She's at a piano lesson with her father." The mention of him made Stella's stomach tighten, though she couldn't quite say why. The billionaire single dad she was here to work for was still a stranger, but she'd seen his name in enough headlines to know the basics. James Holt, 35, CEO of Holt Innovations, known for tech solutions that had changed the way companies managed data security. Known, too, for avoiding the press except for carefully curated appearances. And now, known to her as her new employer. Carla led her downstairs and into the open-plan kitchen, where a tall man stood at the island counter, pouring water into a glass. He wore a fitted charcoal sweater, the kind that looked like it cost more than her entire monthly rent back in the city. His jaw sharp, and his eyes, when they lifted to meet hers, were clear and piercing. "Mr. Holt," Carla said, "this is Stella Morgan." James's gaze swept over her quickly, not in a predatory way, but in a manner that suggested he was cataloging details. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice deep but even. "Welcome." "Thank you," she replied, trying not to let the steadiness of his eyes rattle her. "I've read your references. Carla speaks highly of you." He set the glass down and leaned casually against the counter. "This is a busy house. My schedule changes often. Sophie's welfare comes first. Everything else is secondary. I trust you can work with that." "Yes," Stella said, matching his directness. A faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at his mouth before he nodded. "Good. Sophie should be back any minute. I'm sure she'll have a lot to say." As if on cue, the sound of small footsteps thundered down the hall. A little girl with messy curls burst into the kitchen, her backpack bouncing against her back. "Hi, are you my new nanny?" she asked without hesitation. "I am," Stella said, crouching to her level. "And you must be Sophie." "That's me," she said proudly. "Do you like pancakes?" "I love pancakes," Stella answered. Sophie grinned. "Good. Dads are the best. Even better than Carla's, but don't tell her." James's mouth twitched like he was fighting a laugh. "Sophie," he said gently, "why don't you show Stella your room?" The girl grabbed Stella's hand without waiting for an answer, tugging her upstairs and launching into an enthusiastic tour of her toys, books, and art projects. Her room was bright and colorful, a mix of childlike chaos and surprisingly advanced Lego creations. "Dad works a lot," Sophie confided, arranging her dolls in a neat row. "But he's still fun. He lets me stay up sometimes if there's a meteor shower." It struck Stella then, beneath the modern walls and sleek furniture, this was a home that had tried hard to stay warm. She found herself wanting to be part of that warmth, though she didn't yet understand why. Later, after dinner, she settled into her room, unpacking her clothes into the minimalist dresser. Through the wall, she could hear faint laughter, Sophie's high-pitched giggle and James's lower rumble in response. She smiled without meaning to. Somewhere deep down, she knew that whatever she had expected of this job, the quiet professionalism, the clear boundaries, was already beginning to blur. By the third morning, Stella had learned two things about James Holt. One, he started his day absurdly early. The smell of coffee drifted through the house before the sun even touched the horizon. Two, he kept his personal life locked tighter than the expensive security system he'd probably designed himself. Not that she was snooping. She just noticed things. The first time they crossed paths in the kitchen that week, it was barely 6:30 a.m. Stella had wandered in, still tugging her sweater tight around her, planning to grab a quick glass of water before Sophie woke. James was already there, hair damp from a shower, navy button-down rolled at the sleeves. He glanced up from the espresso machine. "Morning," he said, in the tone of a man who didn't waste words. "Morning," she replied, feeling unexpectedly aware of her own bedmussed hair. He slid a second mug toward her without asking if she wanted coffee. She accepted it with a quiet thanks, the heat seeping into her fingers. He didn't ask about her sleep. She didn't ask about his meeting later that day. A truce of silence existed between them, not unfriendly but cautious. If Sophie was the sunlight in the house, James was the shadow. Stella was starting to see that he didn't mean to be cold. He was just contained. Like someone who had learned that the more you share, the more you risk losing. With Sophie, however, the walls didn't exist. After school that afternoon, Stella found her in the backyard, sprawled across a blanket with colored pencils scattered everywhere. She was sketching the pool, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "That's really good," Stella said, sitting beside her. "It's not finished," Sophie replied. "Dad says nothing's done until it's done right." It was an interesting thing for a 6-year-old to say, and it made Stella glance toward the house, wondering how much of her father Sophie had already absorbed. "Do you draw?" Sophie asked. "Not really," Stella said with a smile. "But I can try." Sophie handed her a pencil, and for the next half hour, they doodled in the fading afternoon light. Sophie drawing stars over the pool water, Stella attempting a lopsided cat that made them both laugh. When James appeared on the patio, his tie loosened, phone in hand, he paused. Stella noticed the way his eyes flicked from Sophie's delighted grin to her own, a faint, unreadable look crossing his face before he stepped inside without interrupting. That night, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain rattled the glass walls, and lightning flashed against the dark hills beyond. Stella found herself in the living room with Sophie, who insisted they build a lightning fort with couch cushions and blankets. When the little girl finally fell asleep under the fort, her curls spilling over the pillow, Stella carefully tucked her in and headed toward the kitchen for tea. James was there. He was leaning against the counter in sweats and a t-shirt, a rare, casual sight. The low light caught the planes of his face, and for a second, Stella forgot to move. "She's asleep," he asked. "Like a rock," Stella replied, opening a cupboard for a mug. There was a moment of quiet while she poured the tea. The rain filled the silence. Then James said, "She likes you." "That's not common." The comment caught her off guard. "I like her too." His gaze lingered on her for a fraction longer than necessary before he looked away. "Good night, Miss Morgan." She nodded. "Good night, Mr. Holt." And just like that, the wall was back in place. Over the next few days, their paths continued to cross in these small, strangely charged moments. Passing each other in the hall. Reaching for the same dish in the kitchen. Standing on opposite sides of Sophie's bedtime story, both pretending they weren't watching the other. It wasn't romance, not yet. But Stella could feel something humming quietly in the spaces between them. She also felt the danger of it. She wasn't here to blur boundaries. She'd taken this job because she needed stability, not complicated feelings for her employer. Especially one whose reputation came with whispers of both brilliance and heartbreak. Still, sometimes, when James smiled faintly at something Sophie said, or when his voice softened during a phone call she overheard, she caught glimpses of the man beneath the armor. And those glimpses were harder to ignore than she wanted to admit. One Friday evening, Sophie was in the den watching a movie, her laughter spilling through the hall. Stella passed by James's office and saw him seated at his desk, head bent over his laptop. She almost kept walking, but something in the slump of his shoulders made her pause. "Do you want some tea?" she asked softly from the doorway. He looked up, surprised. "Tea? You look like you've been at that screen for hours. It might help." His mouth quirked. "You always offer people tea when they look miserable?" "Only when they're paying me," she teased lightly, then flushed when his eyebrows lifted in mild amusement. He leaned back in his chair, studying her like she was a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the way he'd expected. "Sure," he said at last. "Tea sounds good." When she returned with 2 mugs, she set one on his desk. Their fingers brushed, just for a second, just enough to notice. His eyes flicked up to hers. She stepped back. "Thanks," he said quietly. Stella nodded and left before her pulse could betray her. That night, lying in bed, she listened to the rain still pattering against the windows. Somewhere down the hall, she imagined James in his office, working late into the night alone. She wondered if he even realized how thick the walls around him had become. And she wondered why she suddenly wanted to know what it would take to break through them. It was just after midnight when Stella woke to the sound of muffled crying. At first she thought she'd dreamt it. The rain outside had stopped hours ago, leaving the house steeped in the kind of stillness that made every sound carry. But then she heard it again, a small, choked sob from the room next door. "Sophie." Stella slipped out of bed, pulling on her robe and padding barefoot into the hallway. Sophie's door was cracked open, the dim night light inside casting a faint glow. The little girl was sitting up in bed, her cheeks wet. "Nightmare?" Stella whispered, kneeling beside her. Sophie nodded. I thought I saw Mommy." Her voice trembled. "She was calling me, but then she went away." The ache in Stella's chest was immediate. She smoothed the girl's hair back gently. "It's okay, sweetheart. It was just a dream. Can I sleep in Dad's room?" Sophie asked hesitantly. Stella didn't have to think twice. "Of course." She took Sophie's hand and led her down the hall toward James's room at the far end. She knocked lightly, careful not to wake the whole house. When there was no answer, she knocked again, a little louder. The door swung open. It wasn't Sophie's father in a crisp shirt and controlled expression this time. It was James, barefoot from sleep, wearing only a pair of dark sweatpants slung low on his hips. For a second, neither of them spoke. His eyes were hazy from sleep, but when they landed on her, something flickered. "Stella," he said slowly, voice rough. "What's wrong?" She swallowed, acutely aware of the fact that she was standing there in her robe, holding his daughter's hand, while he looked every inch the kind of man you didn't expect to see in the middle of the night. "Sophie had a nightmare," Stella managed. "She wanted to come to you." At that, his expression softened. He crouched down to Sophie's level, his tone instantly gentle. "Hey, Munchkin. Bad dream." Sophie nodded and went straight into his arms. James scooped her up effortlessly and carried her inside. Stella hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to follow. "Come in," James said, glancing back at her. "It's fine." His bedroom was nothing like she'd imagined, not austere and intimidating, but warm in a minimalist way. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled, a faint scent of clean soap lingering in the air. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the dark hills, the moon casting silver shadows across the floor. James settled Sophie against the pillows, murmuring something low enough that Stella couldn't hear. She hovered near the door, arms folded to keep her hands from fidgeting. When Sophie's breathing began to even out, James stood and looked at Stella. "Thanks for bringing her." "Of course," she said. Her voice felt smaller than she wanted it to. His gaze lingered a fraction too long. It wasn't intentional, at least she didn't think so, but there was a quiet awareness in it. As if, for the first time, he was seeing her in a way he hadn't allowed himself to before. She shifted her weight, heat prickling at the back of her neck. "Well, I should let you both sleep." As she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her. "Stella." She glanced back. There was something unreadable in his face, a mixture of curiosity and restraint. "You're good with her. She doesn't open up to people easily." The compliment caught her off guard. "She's a great kid," Stella said, her lips curving slightly. "She just needs someone to listen." His mouth tugged in what might have been the beginning of a smile, but it faded almost instantly, replaced by the guarded look she'd come to expect. He nodded once. "Good night." "Good night," she echoed, slipping out into the hallway. Back in her own room, Stella sat on the edge of her bed, pulse still quicker than normal. It wasn't just the sight of him standing there in the doorway. Bare skin, sleep-rough voice, the intimacy of seeing him unguarded. It was the moment in his eyes when their gazes had locked. Like something had cracked open for a second before he slammed it shut again. She told herself it was nothing. Just a late-night interruption. Just the natural awkwardness of seeing your boss in his most private space. And yet, when she finally lay down again, the image replayed in her mind. The way the moonlight had caught in his hair, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to Sophie, the unspoken pause when he looked at her. It was nothing. She was almost certain. Almost. The next morning, over breakfast, Sophie was her usual bright self, recounting a dream about riding a unicorn through the kitchen. James was back to his crisp shirt and distant expression, reading something on his tablet. When Sophie ran off to grab her school bag, James glanced at Stella. "She slept better after you brought her." "Thank you." The sincerity in his voice was brief but real. Stella nodded, keeping her tone neutral. "Anytime." Neither mentioned the fact that she'd seen him half-dressed. Neither mentioned the look that had passed between them. But both remembered. The weekend brought a change to the house. Maybe it was the weather, a rare streak of golden autumn sunlight, or maybe it was just that Sophie seemed to have made it her personal mission to keep Stella busy from morning until night. Either way, the hours slipped past in bursts of energy. Pancake breakfasts, hide-and-seek in the upstairs hallway, and an impromptu fashion show with Sophie draping half her dress-up box over Stella. James was around more than usual, though he stayed on the edges at first, phone in hand, watching with that mix of quiet intensity and something softer that he probably didn't realize she noticed. On Sunday afternoon, Sophie tugged at Stella's hand. "Can we go to the village market?" "Dad, please." James glanced up from his laptop on the sofa. "You were just there with Carla last week." "But Stella hasn't seen it," Sophie argued. "She needs to see the candy stall. And the pumpkin bread. And the guy with the carved wood animals." Stella smiled faintly. "It might be fun. If you're not too busy, of course." James's gaze met hers for half a second, that unreadable flicker again, before he set the laptop aside. "All right, let's go." The village was alive with weekend bustle. Stalls lined the square, overflowing with late harvest produce, fresh bread, jars of honey, and handmade crafts. The air was laced with cinnamon and roasting chestnuts. Sophie darted ahead to a stand selling tiny carved horses, leaving Stella and James to walk side by side. "You grew up in the city?" he asked, surprising her. He rarely initiated small talk. "Yes. Noisy, crowded, but full of energy," she said. "You?" He smirked faintly. "Half in a small town, half traveling with my father. He believed in exposing me to as many places, and people, as possible. Sometimes I think it was more about teaching me how to adapt than anything else." "That sounds intense," she said carefully. "It was," he admitted. "But it also meant I learned early how to keep certain parts of myself private." The honesty in his tone was unexpected. Before she could respond, Sophie came running back, clutching a small wooden dog. "Look, it's for you, Stella." "For me?" Stella smiled, taking the smooth little figure from her hands. "I love it. Thank you." "Dad bought it," Sophie whispered loudly. James gave a small shrug when Stella's eyes met his. "Seemed like something you'd keep," he said simply. They were halfway back to the car when it happened. A man pushing a loaded cart down a side street lost his grip on one of the boxes. It tumbled into the path just as Stella stepped forward. She didn't even have time to react before a hand shot out, pulling her back, firm, urgent, and undeniably strong. She stumbled into James's chest, her breath catching at the sudden, solid heat of him. His arm was wrapped securely around her waist, holding her close until the box was dragged out of the way. "You okay?" His voice was low, his breath warm against her temple. She nodded, though her pulse was doing double time. "Yeah, I just didn't see it." He didn't let go immediately. His eyes searched hers, something unspoken moving between them. Then, as if realizing how close they were, he released her, stepping back. Sophie, oblivious to the moment, pointed toward the candy stall. "Can we get fudge before we go?" James's expression returned to neutral, but when he said sure, his voice was softer than usual. The drive back was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat, her head lolling against the window. James glanced at Stella once, catching her tracing the carved wooden dog in her lap. "You really like it?" "I do," she said, smiling faintly. "It's thoughtful." He didn't respond, but she caught the briefest lift at the corner of his mouth before his focus returned to the road. That evening, after Sophie was tucked in, Stella wandered into the kitchen for tea. James was already there, leaning against the counter in a dark sweater, scrolling through something on his phone. "Tea?" she asked. "Sure," he said, setting the phone aside. As the kettle hummed, he spoke without looking at her. "Earlier, with the box, you could have been hurt." She glanced over her shoulder. "I wasn't. Thanks to you." His eyes met hers then, steady and unreadable. "Still, I don't like close calls." There was an edge in his tone, not irritation but protectiveness. It made something warm flicker low in her chest. She handed him a mug. "Guess I'll have to stick close to my bodyguard," she teased lightly. The look he gave her in return was brief, but charged, the kind of look that made her aware of every inch of space between them. Then he took a sip of tea, and the moment dissolved into steam and quiet. Later, alone in her room, Stella sat with the wooden dog on her nightstand. She thought about the market, the way he'd opened up about his past, and that heartbeat-long moment when he'd held her against him. She told herself it was just instinct on his part. Just an employer making sure his nanny didn't get bowled over by a runaway box. But she wasn't sure she believed it anymore. The storm came in without warning. One moment the sky was a calm slate gray, and the next, wind was howling through the trees and rain was slashing sideways against the house's wide glass windows. The first crack of thunder sent Sophie running into Stella's arms in the living room. "It's just noise," Stella reassured her, smoothing her hair. "Like the sky is playing drums." Sophie giggled despite herself. "Loud drums." James appeared from the hall, phone in hand. Power's already flickering. "Carla's upstairs making sure the backup lights are ready." He crouched beside Sophie. "You okay, Munchkin?" "I'm fine," she said, but didn't let go of Stella's arm. A moment later, the lights blinked once, twice, and went out completely. The emergency lamps in the hall clicked on, casting a dim golden glow, but the living room was swallowed in shadows. I'll get candles, James said, his voice calm. When he returned, he set a few on the coffee table, the soft light flickering over his face and making the space feel strangely smaller, warmer. Sophie, reassured by the glow, announced she was going to read in her room until the sky drums stop. James let her go, after promising she could come back downstairs if she got scared again. That left the two of them alone. Storms used to knock out power in my neighborhood all the time, Stella said, tucking her legs under her on the couch. We'd light candles and play cards until it came back. Sounds nice, James said. He was sitting on the opposite end of the couch, his arm resting on the back cushion. We didn't really do that. My parents worked late. If the power went out, I just waited. There was no bitterness in his voice, just a quiet statement of fact. You must have learned to keep yourself occupied, she said. I learned to keep myself to myself, he corrected, meeting her eyes for a beat before looking away. The soft rumble of thunder rolled through the distance. The flicker of candlelight danced over his jaw, the curve of his mouth. She wondered how someone could seem so composed and yet feel like they were carrying something heavy all the time. Can I ask you something? He said suddenly. Sure. His gaze stayed on the candle flame. You've mentioned your family a little, but not much else. No partner back in the city. She shook her head, feeling unexpectedly exposed. No. By choice. Her breath caught. It wasn't an intrusive question, exactly, but it was the kind of thing most people wouldn't ask, and the kind of thing she usually avoided answering. I've never, she hesitated, then decided to just say it. I've never been in a relationship. Not really. Never been touched that way. His head turned toward her, surprise flickering in his eyes, but not judgment. If anything, he looked like he was trying to understand. Why? I guess I've just been cautious, she admitted. And maybe I was waiting for it to feel right. His expression softened, almost imperceptibly. And has it ever felt right? She held his gaze then, her pulse quickening. Not until now. The silence that followed was thick, not awkward but charged. She could hear the storm pounding outside, the faint hiss of candle wicks, her own heartbeat in her ears. James shifted slightly closer, his hand brushing hers on the cushion. Stella. His voice was low, almost a warning, but not one she wanted to obey. She didn't move away. If anything, she leaned into the space between them. He searched her face like he was looking for permission, for certainty. Whatever he found there made his jaw tighten, and then slowly he closed the distance. The kiss was tentative at first, almost cautious, as though he didn't want to startle her. His lips were warm, his hand settling lightly against her cheek. She let herself melt into it, her fingers curling against his sweater, the soft scrape of his stubble sending shivers down her skin. When they finally pulled back, the air between them felt different. Changed. That, she began, but the words didn't seem to want to form. That, he echoed quietly, as if agreeing with something unspoken. She searched his eyes, looking for regret, but found none. Instead, there was the same restrained intensity she'd seen in him since the day they met. Only now it was turned entirely on her. I don't want to complicate your life, he said, his thumb brushing lightly over her hand. Or Sophie's. You're not, she said softly. Not unless you want to. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Sophie's voice carried from upstairs, calling for her dad, and the moment fractured. James stood, glancing toward the stairs. We'll talk later, he said, his tone low. Stella nodded, but her heart was still racing as she blew out one of the candles, watching the smoke curl into the air. Later. She wasn't sure what that meant. But for the first time since arriving at Holt House, she wanted to find out. For the next few days, James was different. Not colder, exactly, but more measured, more careful. If he'd been guarded before, now he seemed determined to keep every interaction between them strictly professional. No lingering glances. No accidental brushes of hands. Nothing to suggest that, during the blackout, he'd kissed her in candlelight like he'd been waiting for the moment all along. It was almost convincing. Almost. Sophie, of course, noticed nothing. She was too busy talking about the big party coming up, the Holt Foundation's annual charity gala. Dad says we're raising money for the new children's hospital wing, she told Stella over breakfast, swinging her legs under the chair. You should come. You can see him in a tux. Stella hid a smile. I'm sure he looks very nice in a tux. Sophie's eyes sparkled. You'll see. 2 days before the gala, James found her in the kitchen sorting through Sophie's school art projects. The gala's black tie, he said, sliding a folded envelope across the counter. This is your invitation. Carla can help you arrange whatever you need to attend. She blinked at him. You want me there? You're part of Sophie's life, he said simply. She'll enjoy having you there. It was a good reason, practical, even. But something in his voice made her think it wasn't the only one. The night of the gala, the city lights glowed against the crisp autumn air. The hotel ballroom was transformed into a glittering expanse of crystal chandeliers, white linens, and tall floral arrangements. James was already there when she arrived with Sophie and Carla. And yes, he looked unfairly good in a tux, the black fabric perfectly tailored. He spotted her across the room, and for a moment his gaze lingered, just a second too long to be casual. Stella's dress was simple but elegant, deep green satin that skimmed her curves without being revealing. She'd pinned her hair up, though a few strands had escaped to brush her neck. Sophie tugged her toward him. See? I told you. You clean up well, Miss Morgan, James said, his tone even, but his eyes giving away a fraction more. So do you, she replied, and for a moment neither of them moved. The evening moved in a blur of speeches, auctions, and polite conversation. James was constantly approached by guests, investors, board members, donors. But every so often, she'd catch his gaze drifting back to where she sat with Sophie. It wasn't until the band began to play a slow jazz number that he appeared at her side. Sophie's with Carla, he said, offering his hand. Dance with me. Her first instinct was to refuse. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure she could stand that close to him without remembering the way he'd kissed her. But his hand stayed extended, steady and patient. She took it. The moment they stepped onto the floor, the rest of the room seemed to fade. His hand settled at her waist, warm through the fabric of her dress, while her other hand rested against his shoulder. They began to move, slow and unhurried. You're good at this, she murmured. Had to learn, he said, his thumb brushing against her side as they turned. Part of the job. Her eyes lifted to his. And tonight? Is this part of the job? The corner of his mouth curved, just barely. Not exactly. The music wrapped around them, smooth and low, and she realized she was breathing in time with him. Every shift of his hand, every subtle movement of his body against hers, sent a current through her that she couldn't ignore. You're making this hard, he said suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. She swallowed. What am I making hard? Keeping things simple. They didn't speak again until the song ended. Even then, neither of them let go right away. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. On the drive home, Sophie fell asleep in the back seat, her head against Stella's arm. James kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. When they reached the house, Carla carried Sophie upstairs, leaving them alone in the quiet foyer. Thank you for coming, James said. It was polite, formal, but the way his eyes swept over her once before he turned away told her everything else he wasn't saying. She stood there long after he'd gone upstairs, her heart racing in that maddening, familiar way. That night, she lay awake replaying the dance. The pressure of his hand at her waist. The way his voice had dipped when he'd told her she was making things hard. She wasn't naive. She knew what was happening. She also knew that neither of them seemed willing, or able, to stop it. It started with a cough. Nothing unusual. Sophie had been running around in the crisp evening air the day before, her cheeks pink from chasing the neighbor's dog. But by dinner the next night, she was pale, her eyes glassy, pushing her food around the plate. I'm not hungry, she murmured. James's brow furrowed instantly. He reached across the table, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. She's burning up, he said, his voice tight. Within minutes, Stella was helping him settle Sophie into bed while Carla called the doctor. The diagnosis came quickly, a nasty seasonal flu, the kind that could knock even an adult flat. James insisted on staying in her room. "You don't have to," Stella told him, but he shook his head. "She's my kid," he said simply. The first few hours passed in a blur of cool washcloths, medicine, and coaxing Sophie to drink water. By midnight, Carla had gone to rest, leaving just the two of them in the softly lit room. Sophie was curled under her blankets, breathing shallowly. James sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting lightly on hers. He didn't move when Stella came back from refilling the water glass. "She's going to be okay," Stella said gently. "I know," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. His gaze stayed fixed on his daughter. "When her mom died, I promised myself I'd protect her from everything. And now she's lying here, and there's nothing I can do to make it stop." Stella's heart ached. She sat beside him. "You're here. That matters more than you think." For the first time all night, he looked at her, really looked at her. His eyes were tired, but there was something raw in them too. "You're good for her. You're good for me." She wasn't sure how to respond to that. Her pulse stumbled, her fingers tightening around the glass in her lap. "James!" He reached up, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You've been in my head since the day you walked into this house," he said, his voice low. "I've been trying not to cross a line. But I can't pretend anymore." Her breath caught. "You don't have to." The air between them seemed to shrink until there was nothing left but heat and intent. His hand cupped her jaw, and then his mouth was on hers, not tentative like the first time, but deep, certain, urgent. She leaned into him, her hand sliding to his chest, feeling the steady thud of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, Sophie stirred, mumbling something in her sleep. They both froze, glancing at her before quietly slipping into the hallway. Outside Sophie's room, the air felt different, sharper, heavier. James leaned against the wall, his hands braced on either side of her. "I don't want to just kiss you in the dark and pretend it didn't happen," he said. "I want more. And I think you do too." She searched his face, every guarded wall he'd ever built now stripped away. "I do," she admitted, her voice steady. He didn't speak again. He just took her hand and led her toward his room. The world outside ceased to exist once the door shut behind them. His mouth was on hers again, his hands tracing the lines of her back, her waist, her hips like he was memorizing them. She'd never been touched like this. Not just with desire, but with reverence, as if he was afraid she might slip away. Every movement was slow at first, deliberate. He gave her space to breathe, to feel, to trust. But the longer they stayed tangled together, the more urgent it became. Not rushed, but impossible to stop. By the time they lay together in the quiet aftermath, the storm in her chest had softened into something warm and steady. James's arm was draped over her waist, his breath slow against her hair. "You're incredible," he murmured, and there was no smooth CO polish in his voice now, just the truth. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over his. "So are you." They stayed like that until Sophie stirred again, her soft voice carrying down the hall. James pressed a quick kiss to Stella's shoulder and rose to check on her. Stella stayed in the bed for a moment, her mind spinning. She'd come here for a job. She'd never expected to fall asleep in the arms of the man who'd hired her. And yet, nothing about it felt wrong. If anything, it felt like the most right thing she'd ever done. The morning after, Stella woke alone. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she'd dreamed the whole night. The heat of his hands, the steady weight of his arm around her, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only person in the world. But then she heard his voice down the hall, soft and low, speaking to Sophie. She slipped into her robe and followed the sound. Sophie was curled in her dad's lap in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, a faint flush still in her cheeks but a smile on her face. James looked up when Stella stepped in. His eyes softened, but his voice stayed even. "She's feeling better," he said. "Good," Stella replied, crouching beside the sofa. "Ready for breakfast, kiddo?" "Only if you make pancakes," Sophie said with a grin. Stella laughed. "Deal." The day passed in a blur of quiet recovery. Sophie rested. James took calls from home, and Stella found herself moving easily between caring for them both. a rhythm that felt natural, almost like it had been there all along. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, James found her in the kitchen rinsing mugs. He took the one from her hand, set it aside, and said, "We need to talk." Her heart skipped. About last night? About everything. He leaned against the counter, folding his arms. "I don't want this to be a secret, or a one-time thing. But if we do this, it has to be deliberate. Not rushed. For Sophie's sake as much as ours." Stella searched his face. "You're saying you want to be with me?" "I'm saying I want to date you," he said plainly. "Not in the shadows. Not between work and school runs. I want to do it right." It was such a James thing to say. Thoughtful, measured, but threaded with sincerity. And it made her chest ache in the best way. "I want that too," she said quietly. His mouth curved, just slightly. "Then we'll start there." 2 weeks later, he told Sophie. They were sitting at the kitchen island when he said, "Sweetheart, you know Stella's important to you, right?" Sophie nodded, sipping her juice. "She's my favorite grown-up besides you. And she's important to me too. I'd like to spend more time with her, like a girlfriend." Sophie's eyes lit up instantly. "Does that mean she'll stay forever?" James chuckled. "That's the hope." Sophie turned to Stella with complete seriousness. "Then you have to say yes." "I already did," Stella said, smiling. Sophie's answering grin was bright enough to light the whole room. Months passed, and dating blurred seamlessly into family life. James made time, real time, for them. Dinner out when Sophie had sleepovers. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. Quiet evenings curled on the couch with a movie and his arm around her shoulders. The walls around him didn't vanish overnight, but they cracked piece by piece, until she began to see the man underneath. The one who laughed more easily, who listened more than he spoke, who looked at her like she was something rare. And for Stella, every touch, every kiss, felt like the answer to a question she'd been carrying her whole life. 1 year later, the autumn air was crisp again, the leaves burning gold at the edges. Holt House hadn't changed much, still sleek and modern, still filled with the warm chaos of Sophie's energy. But life inside its walls felt entirely different. Stella was in the kitchen, humming as she poured tea, when James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. She leaned back into him instinctively. "You're up early," she said. "I wanted to watch you panic over Sophie's birthday cake," he teased, pressing a kiss to her neck. "It's not panic," she said with mock offense. "It's focused determination." From the living room, Sophie's voice carried. "Dad. Stella. Come see what I built." James's smile warmed against her skin. "In a minute," he called back. He turned her gently in his arms. "You know, this time last year, you were unpacking your suitcase in the guest room. And you were pretending you didn't notice me," she teased. "I noticed," he said, his voice low. "Every second." Her heart still stuttered the way it had that night in the storm. "You've ruined me for anyone else, you know." "Good," he said simply, leaning in to kiss her. "Because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you never feel untouched again." She smiled against his lips, thinking of how far they'd come, from guarded glances to this quiet certainty, from strangers in a sprawling house to a family. Outside, the leaves drifted on the wind, and inside, the world was exactly where she wanted it to be. We have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories.